Hello, and welcome to Chapter 11. In this chapter, we'll be covering factorial designs. So by the end of this short video, you should be able to understand what a factorial design is, know what a main effect is, and be able to know what data you look at to tell us if there is a main effect. So far, we've been discussing simple experimental designs where there's only one variable that's being manipulated or controlled. Now that variable is called a factor. So a factor is known as an independent variable in an experiment. And we discussed this earlier in the semester. Hopefully you also noticed when you were doing your SPSS analysis, the place that you put your independent variable in to run the analysis was also labeled as a factor. Now things really aren't this simple in research. So researchers use what are known as factorial designs to study these more complex situations. Now remember that this independent variable is called a factor, and it's an independent variable whether it is truly manipulated or just a matter of convenience like we saw last week in our quasi-experimental designs. So as I said, when you have more than one factor in an experiment, we call it a factorial design. So this is a research design that includes two or more factors. When you have a 2x2 design, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 conditions. So if you were to have a 2x3 study, you would have one variable here, and 1, 2, 3 levels of a second variable, giving you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different conditions. So a two-factor design has two independent variables, and a single-factor design has one independent variable. And a 2x3x2 design is a three-factor design with a total of 12 different conditions. So you saw I wrote the other two in the slide. This one's a little bit more complicated and more difficult to demonstrate. So a simple two-factor design can be represented by a matrix, which is what I was showing you on the previous slide. Now each cell can correspond to a separate treatment condition or a specific combination of the factors as we get more complex. So here's an article that we're going to use for discussion for most of the rest of this video at least. And it says that ostracism has a powerful negative effect on individuals. Face-to-face, ostracism is not necessary for these effects to emerge. They occur also in internet ball toss games and within chat rooms. In previous research, ostracized individuals observed the interaction between other members of a group. In this experiment, the authors tested whether the imagined ostracism is sufficient to inflict psychological pain. They used a triadic cell phone text messaging method such that after the initial inclusion in a conversation, participants either continued to be included or received no further messages from the others, and saw no messages between the others. Ostracized participants reported worse mood, reported lower levels of belonging, control, self-esteem, and meaningful existence, and wrote more provoking messages. So these variables can be represented in a matrix. And so we have ostracism and inclusion. So this meant that the social interaction. Inclusion meant they continued all along with the cell phone messages. So just I'm going to highlight that here for you. After the initial inclusion in a conversation, participants either continued to be included or received no further messages. So no further messages was the ostracism. Continue to be included was the inclusion group, so that's social interaction. And then they had a group type, which was in-group versus out-group. And this manipulation was created via a question. So the question that they did was, the question that they sent was, do you smoke? And so the Confederate in the in-group situation would respond however the participant in the experiment responded. So if the participant said, yes, I smoke, they would say, oh, so do I. If the participant said, no, I don't smoke, oh, neither do I. In the out group, the response was the opposite. So if the participant responded, I smoke, yes, I smoke, the Confederate would say, oh, well, I don't. And if the participant said, I don't smoke, the Confederate would say, oh, but I do. And then again, they would either be ostracized or they'd continue to be included in the text messaging stream. So the levels of one factor are determined by columns. So here's one factor, and here we're going to see in the next slide that we're going to have total means over here. And the levels of a second factor are determined by the rows. So here are columns for one factor and rows for another factor. So the data in a two-factor design provides three separate and distinct sets of information. And we're talking just about a two-factor design now. There's the main effect of factor A, so the main effect of the factor involving the columns, perhaps. A main effect of factor B, a main effect for the factor involving the rows in the matrix, and then an interaction. And the interaction describes how the factors basically interact, but is the effect of one factor dependent on the effect of the other factor. So here's, again, that table looking at this. So here, one factor is looked at in terms of columns, and to look at the main effect, we look at the overall mean. We look at the mean for the main effect, regardless of what's happening in here. It's comparing this mean to this mean. That would be the main effect for group type. For main effect of factor B, we look at the rows. So we look at these means, the overall, not what's going on in here. So we would compare this mean to look for the main effect of factor B. And to look at the interaction, we're looking at what's going on in this set of means. Does the way that these means change depend on which group they're in, or vice versa? Does the way that these means change depend on which group they're in? So a main effect is the mean differences among the levels of one factor. Again, one factor is going to be looked at in terms of columns, the other factor is going to be looked at in terms of rows. And a two-factor study has two main effects, one for each factor. So here's this again. So we have a main effect for group A. Perhaps that's comparing the overall means in the rows. And we have a main effect for factor B, looking at the overall means in the columns. So for part of the lab today, what you're going to be doing is going in and finding data to fill in here. And knowing to look where, and one of the goals is to know where to look. So if we compare the column means here, again, that's the main effect for group type. If we look at the row means here, that's the main effect for social interaction.